So welcome back to the channel, or if you're new here, I'm Sunny and this is my producer Charlie, and this is someone else's cloud. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to get started with Enterprise Policy as Code. So if you're watching this video, I'll assume that you're working in Azure and most likely working with Azure Policy, and you're looking at a way to manage Azure Policy at scale and most likely trying to automate it and manage it through code. And this is where Enterprise Policy as Code comes into play. So what is Enterprise Policy as Code, also known as EPAC? So EPAC is a framework that was developed in PowerShell to allow you to deploy and manage your Azure policies at scale, which I will walk through on how we get started. So let's do a quick refresher on Azure Policy in itself. So I've got a couple of slides here where we just talk about the key benefits and what it really is. So what are the benefits of Azure Policy? Governance and compliance control. So Azure Policy enforces organizational standards by auditing, denying, or remediating non-compliant resources across management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. It ensures compliance with internal policies and regulatory frameworks like ISO 27001, CIS, and Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. Azure Policy also allows you to apply policy at scale. Through policy assignments, initiatives, and remediation tasks, Azure Policy automatically applies configurations and corrections across your environments. This enables consistent governance across hundreds of subscriptions, integrating with CI/CD and IAC tools such as EPAC, Terraform, and Bicep for automated compliance. And another benefit is remediation. So built-in compliance dashboards provide real-time insights into the policy state of your environment and identifying drift and risks early. This visibility allows continuous policy tuning, proactive governance, and evidence-based reporting to management and auditors. So let's talk about the anatomy of an Azure policy. I got this idea of the name from watching a recent video by John Saville, which I'll link below, which is called Anatomy of Azure Policy. And it's great to walk through every component of Azure Policy. So let's talk about policy definitions. So this is pretty much the core of Azure Policy, and it's basically business rules written in JSON that specifies the conditions and the effect to take when a resource is non-compliant. So if you look on the right here, this is pretty much what an Azure policy looks like. And if we break down the core components of a policy definition, we'll start with the rule. So the policy rule is a logical condition that compares resource properties to required values. So this could be, not having public access on. The example here is specific regions only. Let's talk about the next critical component, which is effect. So this is the action to take when the rule is met. So examples include deny, audit, append, and deploy if not exists. So this can pretty much deny specific regions like this example here. Okay, let's talk about the last key component, which is parameters. So parameters enable policy definitions to be reusable and flexible by allowing you to set specific values when assigning the policy instead of hard coding them. So this would allow you to create an assignment using this policy definition, but passing different attributes. So you could have two different initiatives that are scoped to two different subscriptions, and they're limited to two different locations. So you'd pass the different locations as parameters. So the next one is policy initiatives. So a policy initiative is pretty much a collection of policy definitions that are grouped together for streamlined management and easy application. So this is generally recommended because then it allows you to basically start an initiative that could be, say, the corporate compliance initiative, and then you can just add policy definitions. Rather than just applying a single or assigning a single policy definition, you could have initiatives, also known as policy sets. And then lastly, we got policy assignment. So an assignment that applies a specific policy definition or initiative to a defined scope. So as you can see here, we have an assignment, and the assignment is going to assign the initiative, and the initiative is basically a collection of those policy definitions. And within an assignment, we have a scope. So the scope is the hierarchy where the policy is applied. So obviously, if you're applying it at a certain management group, it will cascade down. And let's talk about exemptions. So exemptions are pretty much the ability to exclude specific resources or scopes from a policy assignment. And in most cases, in a large-scale environment, you generally have exemptions in some aspect because there are legacy items or remediation activities that need to occur before you can actually apply the policy at scale. So you just have an exemptions for certain resources. Okay, so now let's talk about getting started. So there are software requirements, which is very straightforward. So you need PowerShell 7.4 and above. So I've got little descriptions here on how you can install PowerShell. Next up is the AZ module. So if you're using PowerShell and interfacing with Azure, you only need the AZ module. And then lastly is the Enterprise Policy as Code module. So in the description, I show you how to run the commands to install it, but I will also share the getting started link below. Okay, so next up, let's talk about the minimum Azure RBAC that you would need to manage policy at scale. So first off is the resource policy contributor. So you'd need this to manage all aspects of Azure policy. Next up is the role-based access control administrator, which is generally needed to do the role assignment if you ever need to remediate or deploy if not exists in the policies itself. And then last is management group contributor. So this is not really required because you can see here, it's only really required for the hydration kit, which is where it creates a scaffolding of all the management groups. So you generally don't need that unless you're planning to do that. Next up, let's talk about the EPAC configuration folders and files. EPAC has a requirement of a certain folder structure. So if we have a look here, we've got an Enterprise Policy as Code folder. So that folder in itself can be whatever you want to call it. Just this example, it's called Enterprise Policy as Code. Now, what's important is the content inside and the structure. So the structure needs to be definitions and then the folders below, including the global.json. So we'll just talk about what each folder is. First folder is policy assignments. So this is pretty much the folder where all assignments exist for policies and initiatives. And then you have your policy definitions. So this stores all the Azure policy definitions. Then you have the policy documentations, which is the optional documentation for policies and initiatives. Then next up is the policy exemptions folder, which is basically where you store your Azure policy exemptions. Next up is the policy set definitions, which is also known as the initiative. So this is where your policy sets / initiatives are stored. And then the core file that drives everything is the global settings.json C file. And a JSON C file is just a JSON file that supports comments. So this is a central EPAC configuration file that controls how deployments run. So let's talk about the global settings file. The global settings.json C file defines the core configuration for EPAC, including the deployment root scope, desired state strategy, excluded scopes, metadata defaults, and how policy definitions, initiatives, assignments, and role assignments are processed and deployed. So this is what a global settings.json C file looks like. And we'll walk through the key attributes and what they are used for. Okay, so let's start with PAC owner ID. So this attribute is very important. It's a unique GUID that identifies what manages this instance of EPAC. So what I've discovered is this metadata attribute that is embedded throughout all the policy assignments, definitions, and things like that is how EPAC identifies that it owns and manages it. And if you ever have policies that don't have a PAC owner ID, which means not using EPAC, based on your desired state strategy, it can potentially clear out policies that don't have any PAC owner ID. So PAC owner ID is only used when you're using EPAC because it injects this metadata and tags it being managed by a certain instance of EPAC in itself. So it's quite an important attribute. Next up is PAC environments. So this defines the environment-specific settings for running EPAC. So as you can see, if you understand JSON, you've got a PAC environment there, and then you basically have a block for this tenant below it. You can have another block below it, which is another EPAC environment. So let's go to PAC selector. So this basically controls which configuration files EPAC loads based on the environment scope and tags. So this is the unique key identifier for this block of configuration. In this example, we have tenant and everything below it is basically managed under this tenant block. So you would call the tenant block when you're deploying, and everything below it is a configuration that will be deployed. So cloud is obviously the cloud that you're in, so generally Azure Cloud. The tenant ID is obviously the tenant ID that you plan to deploy EPAC. Next up is the deployment root scope. So going back to the Azure RBAC, obviously the RBAC needs to have permissions at a minimum at this scope. And this is basically the top level management group or subscription where EPAC begins to deploy policies. So this is the root of where EPAC will deploy policies. So next up is desired state. So desired state has a very key attribute, which is strategy. So I've got a screenshot here, which is actually from the EPAC documentation. So I'll read exactly what they do. So there's full, which means EPAC manages all policy resources in the deployment root scope and its children. So EPAC will delete any policy resources not defined in the EPAC repo. So full basically means if there's any policies that don't have a PAC owner ID, it will delete them. And then the next attribute is owned only. So EPAC will only manage the policies that are defined in code. So if there are other policies that are out there, it won't care about them at all. So this is very important on how you manage EPAC in itself. But like I said, the one caveat is if there are other policies out there that have a PAC owner ID, when you have it set to full, it will not modify those at all because it assumes that there is another EPAC instance managing those policies. So next up is keep DFC security assignment. So this basically prevents EPAC from removing Defender for Cloud created security assignments. So the next one is do not disable deprecated policies. So it stops EPAC from disabling policies Microsoft has marked as deprecated. And then the next attribute is global not scopes. And this is basically where you can provide an exemption to certain scopes. So in this example, I've got an unmanaged management group, which I've added to deployment not scopes, which means EPAC will add a not scope to the assignment, which means the policies will not apply at that scope level across all your EPAC code. Okay, and last is managed identity location. So this is the Azure region where EPAC will create a managed identity where it will use to remediate policies or deploy if not exists. So let's talk about the deployment scripts. So I've got this diagram from the EPAC documentation, and it basically shows you your folder structure on the left, as well as your JSON configs. So let's kick off with build deployment plans. So this will basically read your global settings where you pass through your PAC selector if you have several PAC environments or PAC configurations in there. Then you'll go through all your folders and all your JSONs and organize them by scopes. And then what will happen is when you run it, it builds a deployment plan pretty much. And these files will be generated based on if you have policies or if you have roles or both. So the key focus on the first one is the policy plan. This is pretty much a JSON file that's outputted into an output folder generally. And the next phase will use this file to actually deploy the policy plan. So the good thing about this is it will only deploy from that JSON file. So there's no external factors. It will only deploy what you've built from that JSON. So even if you made a change to any of those configuration files, but you don't rerun the build deployment plans, the same JSON file will exist. So when you run the deploy policy plan, it will basically deploy that JSON file to Azure. And then if you do have a roles-plan file, you need to go to the next step, which is the deploy roles plan. So this will pretty much apply all the role assignments that your policies need to remediate, enforce policies, or anything else. And that's pretty much a quick start on enterprise policy as code. So let's pray to the demo gods and walk through a demo now.
Franz, could you try to break this glass, please?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, maybe that was a little too hard.
So let's have a quick look at the enterprise policy as code website. I'll put all links below to anything that I reference in this video. So as you can see here, there's actually now a YouTube channel for EPAC. So if you have a look here, I'll also put the link below. There's basically a video that was just released 2 weeks ago. Let's go back to the documentation. So we got this at a good time because version 11 was just released a few days ago. And as you can see here, the new modern look. So the old look looked a bit old school, and now it's invigorated with a whole bunch of colors and better formatting. So as you can see here, there is a getting started link. So I've covered some of these aspects, but if you want to go read in more detail, it's all here. There's also a link to the global settings file. So there is actually a lot of good documentation here that covers a lot of things, but let's go have a look at the repo itself. So this is the repo, which I am going to go into VS Code and clone. Okay, so if you've seen my previous videos, I generally use WSL. I just find that when I'm dealing with code, sometimes Windows puts funny characters when I'm checking in code. So I prefer to use WSL when I'm working with code. So one thing I've started doing is started using PowerShell inside WSL. I used to have VS Code Insider Edition, so completely different install that was only specific to PowerShell, but now I do it all in WSL. You can see here I have PowerShell 7.5.1, so the minimum requirement for EPAC is PowerShell 7.4 plus. So if we just clone this repo now what we're also going to do is create a new folder called Enterprise Policy as Code. So the whole reason why I'm cloning it is because I want the starter kit. Now, because I have the Enterprise Policy as Code module already installed, as well as the AZ module, I don't need anything really in this repo besides the starter kit for this demo. Now, there are additional scripts. So if you have a look here, there's a whole bunch of scripts, especially the operational ones. And some of the commands are also functions inside the module. So you can see here, you've got the build deployment plans and deploy policy plan and things like that. But yeah, you should definitely go through this. This is also documented as well. Make sure that you go and reference the documentation. But what I want is this definition commons folder. And I'm just going to copy it to this Enterprise Policy as Code folder. And then I'm also just going to go inside it. So you can see here, I've got this commons folder. So as I showed before, it needs to be a folder called definitions. So we're just going to remove these commons. There's also some examples here, which we're going to clean up. So if you have a look here, there's some policy set definitions. I'll leave the locations one. And this is also the exemptions example. We're just going to delete it all. Okay, so there's no other definitions here because the locations one, I believe, is using a built-in definition. So that's why there's no location definition. So you can see here this allowed locations has a policy set name, and this ID is actually within Azure. But I'll show you what we'll do is we'll deploy the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, which is also a built-in policy definition. So let's break down the global settings first. So we're just going to delete this, and we'll just call our pack selector EPAC demo. Now let's go and populate this. Okay, so this is my management group structure. So you can see here I have Contoso, and then I have a self-managed, sandbox, platform, landing zones, holding, and decommissioned. So just need to get our tenant ID, which is generally the root tenant group. And if we just go back, so management, Contoso is where we will deploy this EPAC instance at the top level. And we're going to set this to full, and we'll just set this to Australia East. What we'll also do is we'll just add we'll add platform to the not scopes. And okay, so we have now got our global settings, but what we'll add is a new grid. Like I said, the grid is a unique identifier that tells EPAC what identity manages it. It's not really an identity, it's like a unique identifier. So we've got that down. Now let's just make sure all of our code aligns with our pack selector. So if you have a look here under assignments, so we don't need to modify anything. This is already pre-done, so you can see here. But what we'll do is we'll just add a name to this, and we'll just call it EPAC demo. And we'll also add it here. And we'll just put Australia East. And we just need to make sure that this key matches the pack selector. And then this would just be, this will deploy this assignment at this scope. So the global settings file does not dictate, I guess, where these policy assignments are actually assigned. So obviously it manages this at the top level, but we're also going to assign a policy at the same level. So the assignments are what assigns the policies itself. Then what we're going to do is we're just going to copy this and we're going to add this. And what we're going to do is we'll just rename this. And this will be the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark, and we'll just call it baseline. Okay, so let's go through and manage this. So node name is generally like a folder on how you can manage all your policies. So you can separate them, say, by networking, compute, location, whatever else. So we'll just call this one MCSB. Okay, so let's just call this one. This is generally, I believe, the ID. So MCSB-baseline. And then we'll call this Microsoft. So what we need is the policy set name, which is also the ID. So if we go back to Azure and we just go to Azure Policy, we go to definitions, there is a built-in policy called Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. So this one here. So what we just need to do is we grab the ID. So this is the ID, but we only need the GUID. So we'll delete the rest. And what we'll do is we'll just grab this description and we'll put this here. So this will add the description as well. So let's see. So we don't need the parameters. Now the scope, so EPAC demo, so we just need to make sure that matches. And this is going to Contoso as well. So this should deploy a Microsoft security benchmark at the top level. And then we'll have an allowed locations as well. So we've got nothing else. And we have our global settings file, which is done. Okay, so if we go over to PowerShell, we can just import the module. You can generally go get commands, and this basically lists all the commands. So this PowerShell module just has all the commands built in. If you have multiple pack selectors in here, you can generally pass through pack selector environments and certain attributes. But what we're going to do is I'm just going to run this command, which is the build deployment plans, which will just default a whole bunch of things like the output folder, as well as the pack selector and everything else. But if you have several, you can pass through different syntaxes. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this. So you can see here the interface has been updated. So there's all these informative colors as well. Previously, it kind of looked like a little DOS prompt and it was quite hard to read. But now there's colors that show you key attributes that you need to see. So you can see here that I've been playing with different instances of EPAC. So it was a bit of fiddling around. You can see here that it's changing my pack owner ID because I was deploying with the previous one to make sure it would work. So it's updating the allowed locations initiative, which I deployed previously. But you can see here, there's 2 assignment files. So you can see there's 2 new ones. And you can see there'll be 2 new changes here. So what happens is this output folder is created. So obviously you can redirect the output to somewhere else if you want. And you can see I've got no role assignments, but I do have a policy plan. And this pretty much shows you the new update and the delete. So you can see here, the policy definitions, policy set definitions, there's no new, there's no delete, but there's an update. And this is where it's updating the pack owner ID on the location. And then you can see here, it will basically create these assignments here. So you can see there's 2 new assignments. So you should be able to see there's 2 different assignments here. And that's pretty much what the policy plan looks like. So when you run the next command, which is the deploy policy plan, it will only deploy what is in the policy plan file. So like I said, if you make changes to your EPAC code, but you don't do the build, it will not update the policy plan.json, so only deploy what's there. So if I just run this, it will pretty much just deploy it, and it's pretty straightforward. So you can see there, it's pretty much deployed it. So if we quickly go back to Azure, so we'll just wait for this to update, and I should have some assignments eventually. So one little gripe with this policy interface is you have scopes. So let's just highlight the scope that I expect these policies to be deployed and refresh it, and hopefully they appear. There they are. So we've just deployed these two. So obviously the allowed locations, you should be able to see the allowed locations. The parameter there is Australia East. So you can see here the Microsoft security benchmark, and you can see here the default parameter values, which you can override if you need to. And what we should have is excluded scopes. So you can see here, I've got the management platform. I added that in the global not scopes. So if we go to the management groups, generally you can check at a level. Now, I don't think these have processed yet, but if we just have a quick look at policy, generally it gets a bit confusing in the interface, because when you look at policies, what you generally see is, although this policy has a not scope, it'll still appear here. But generally, the resource compliance will be zeros.
3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
Okay, so if we go to the policy overview section, it will show you a high-level update on what my compliance levels look like. So I don't think the one at the platform level has updated yet, but I've just got a handful of subscriptions. So you can see here, if we go into the compliance, we can break it down further. So you can see locations, obviously compliant, and then the Microsoft security benchmark. So we can go further in and drill in to see what's non-compliant. And you can see here, there's basically a whole bunch of things like setting up alerts and a whole bunch of privileged access, incident response, data protection policies, and a whole bunch have not started. See if we could set the not scopes. If we look at the platform management group, I don't know if it'll show yet. No. Okay, so that's a pretty quick demo on how to get started with enterprise policy as code. Hello, so Future Sunny here. Guess what? I didn't even talk about pipelines. So I thought I'd quickly interrupt this video to talk about the templates that are available in the EPAC repo, as well as some safeguards that you should add in your repos, as well as your pipelines, just to ensure that there's no accidental changes, as well as an approval process, stage gates, and some sort of governance. So that way there is some sort of control around policy management in your environment. So let's quickly go and have a look at the EPAC repo again. So under the starter kit folder, there's actually a pipelines folder, and there's a whole bunch of pipeline templates here for GitHub Actions, GitLab, as well as Azure DevOps. So I'm not going to walk through how a pipeline works and how to create one. I'd suggest that you go through all this in your own time, and I assume that you have some sort of understanding in pipelines already. So let's quickly cover some of the things that I guess people should know, or maybe some people aren't enforcing at this point. So firstly, this is Azure DevOps and this is Azure Repos. Git also has it, and GitLab will have it as well. If you go in and manage your repos, you can add policies. So what you want is branch protection policies. You should have a minimum of at least one approval for each pull request. And you should be protecting main, so then that means people cannot push unexpected changes into main without approvals, as well as the security controls, obviously making sure people have the right access to contribute, as well as giving people the ability to approve. So let's flick over to the pipeline. So a pipeline is quite straightforward. You can see here, I really don't like folder paths. And one simple thing that you should do is use artifacts. The whole point of using artifacts is to ensure that you time box your change, so there's no external factors that can play into your deployments. So EPAC in itself has a very good safeguard where it will only deploy changes that are in a plan file. And obviously a plan file running through a pipeline will not be generated externally. It will be all contained within the pipeline. But using artifacts is a good way to just ensure that it's time boxed and there's no external factors in any sort of way. And then the other thing is you should leverage on environments in Azure DevOps. So with environments, you can safeguard, say, the deployment stage, And you can see here that you can also have a check to make sure that the pipeline can only run from the main branch, as well as you can have approvers. So ensuring that there are approval stage gates before any deployment. And obviously you should have your own change control processes, and you should probably have a separate exemption process. That way you can include external approvals, any artifacts, and just having that human sort of governance process on top of your exemptions. And then on top of that, you can obviously add security checks like using Sneak or Chekhov or something to actually scan your pipelines as well. But they are my simple recommendations to ensure that there are no accidental changes in your environment. But anyways, let's get back to the video. We'll just go over a couple of things from the documentation. There's a couple of tools that I didn't really mention, which is documented here somewhere. Let me find it here. There's a couple of tools that will help you managing Azure Policy in itself. So the first one is this AzAdvertizer. So what we can do is, if I just quickly flick back, and if we go find this, just let me grab the MCSB stuff. What we can do is we can search for initiatives, just go all, and we should be able to just search for the ID. So you can see here, it's basically the Microsoft Security Cloud Security Benchmark. So if you're ever trying to find any sort of built-in policies, this is very handy. It also will show, if you drill into it, it should show what a policy will look like. So if you ever need to create your own policies from scratch, there should be, I believe, a section here. So what the JSON file looks like in itself. So you can see here. So you can pretty much find all built-in policies. There's also community policies here. If we just go to all policies, you can search for whatever you want. So let's say we're after description. Let's say TLS. You can also say category, storage. So you can see here there's a whole bunch of TLS storage policies, which are built in. It does show here community, and I believe there's ALZ, and there's a whole bunch of other ones, so built in. But that's a good one to see what the schema is, what the attributes are for policy in itself. And then the other tool that it mentions was this one, which is Azure Governance Visualizer, which is AKA AzGovViz, which will basically do an audit of your entire environment and show you policy assignments, role assignments, and it will highlight, any sort of issues like having owner at the top level and anything else. I don't have an example here, but I'd suggest you have a play with this and do a quick run. Actually, there might be a quick demo here. So this is pretty much the report that gets created when you run this PowerShell tool in your environment. But generally it's just a HTML file locally. And it basically summarizes your entire environment from a policy /RBAC management group structure or anything else. So a very high level overview, but I thought I'd just highlight those tools. And like I said, there is also the EPAC YouTube channel. So I suggest you go subscribe, which I'm not, so I'm going to subscribe right now. But yeah, this is definitely handy to keep an eye on this, especially if you're managing policy as code. And that's pretty much it for this video. So stay tuned for the next one, and I'm signing out. See ya.